Well, one of these Easter Sundays, maybe one of us needs to say something like, "We know this is hard to believe." That would be a start. And then maybe share with people, when this gets hard to believe, here's what you do. Because at some point the Easter high wears off, and the questions arise, and the things we've committed to in our lives seem stranger or less possible. I think for many, our first reaction is, that, again, that Easter high wears off. That is hard to believe. I don't think I belong among those who say they believe. I'm not sure I'll be back. Instead, what if we spoke openly to one another? This is hard to believe. And then say, and that's why you keep coming back. Because Jesus keeps showing up. In these Sundays right after Easter, we read the stories of how Jesus appeared to them on Easter, and then he keeps showing up. And for those who needed another point of connection, they got it. And for those who missed it the first time, they got included. If you find yourself knowing you believed before, but something now seems to be in the way, hear this story. He'll be back. Poor Doubting Thomas. I push against this every year. He's always called Doubting Thomas. You probably heard that. I've tried out lots of other names for him. I think my favorite is Normal Thomas, because this is completely normal. Right? For one thing, the other 10 remaining apostles say to him, "We've seen the Lord." And he says, "Well, I can't believe that. I wasn't here. I didn't see it." Well, they can't say anything, because guess who said to them, "I have seen the Lord," and they didn't believe it? Mary Magdalene. They were in exactly the same position until Jesus showed up for them. Now we hear about Thomas, one who, from ancient times to the present day, is one of the most relatable characters in Scripture. As we try to unpack such a rich gospel today, I think this is an especially good week, where we hear again and again the word believe, believe. Don't be unbelieving, but be believing, and so on. To just mention that the word that's usually translated as a noun as faith and as a verb as believe could just as easily be translated trust, both as a noun and as a verb. And sometimes I think it's helpful to just, and maybe one of these years, I'll just read this gospel and we'll substitute trust, and you'll hear things like Jesus saying to Thomas, "Don't be untrusting, be trusting." Or we'll hear that last phrase where the evangelist comes out and says, "Here's why I wrote the book." Did you catch that? And says, "Hey, you reader, here's why I wrote the book. So that through believing you will have life in his name." Or through trusting, you will have life in his name. I think we need to add that trusting meaning here, because for us, if we use the word believe, that's a head thing for us. If you trust, that's a heart thing. And I think we're talking about heart stuff. In fact, we're talking about whole self stuff. So as I said, as we gather today, we need an Easter season. To unpack this, I think Easter morning we're confronted with the possibility of resurrection. And then for weeks afterward, we get to ponder the possibilities of resurrection. If Christ is risen, then what? For me and for you and for this world. And so over these next 6 or 7 weeks, we'll be reading from the Gospels, mostly from John. We'll be reading from Acts as our first reading, as you heard today. Peter's speech when the apostles are called in for a kind of a trial, not unlike Jesus' trial. And he defends what they've been doing and proclaims Jesus. We'll read from Acts each week, and we'll read from Revelation each week. We heard today from Revelation 1, and we'll get a little sampling of that book through the Easter season. And each of those has their purpose. Acts, especially in this Easter season, emphasizes the transformation of these apostles. Right? When you see Peter there standing before the Sanhedrin and the high priest and saying, here's what we believe, and we're going to proclaim it because Jesus told us to. Boy, that's a far cry from hiding in a locked room, isn't it? That's the possibilities of resurrection playing out in the apostles' lives. They go, to use the words of preacher Mike Coffey, from fear to faith, from timidity to tenacity. We see that transformation in the apostles, the possibilities of resurrection as it plays out in their lives. You know, we don't tend to see possibilities, we tend to see obstacles. My need for forgiveness, how can this ever begin when I so desperately need to be forgiven for some things? The obstacles of my fear, my doubt, my mistrust, my disbelief, my sense that I've been missing out. You know, like Thomas, I've missed out on some things. I'm not sure this is for me. Or I'm reminded when I read these gospel readings, our disunity. Sometimes we think that's a real obstacle, right? Even those first disciples disbelieving the Mary and the women and their report, and then that persisting disagreement with Thomas until Jesus comes for him too. Well, in this Easter season, we see God's ability to overcome all those obstacles. To these disciples who feel they're unforgiven. They betrayed and abandoned their Lord. And then here he is, and the first words out of his mouth, peace be with you. Peace be with you. To the unforgiven, he says, peace be with you. To the disbelieving, he says, here I am. Right? To those who haven't seen, he says, blessed are you who have not seen and yet have come to trust and believe. Jesus gives them whatever they need, overcomes these obstacles, enters into Easter possibilities. He gives them whatever they need until these cowering and confused disciples become the courageous and confident apostles we know. We'll see that each week in Acts. We're also reading from Revelation. And as we do, I think you'll see or be reminded what a wondrous, beautiful book this is. And what a problematic book, so open to strange interpretations and rabbit holes. Today's reading, it's breathtaking, it's beautiful, the one who was and who is to come, the Alpha and the Omega. But I'm afraid it's found its place in our imagination in a way that can lead to trouble. You know, if somebody says to you, Jesus is coming, this reading might be what you picture, right? This is the one where he's coming on the clouds, and we get this sense of some sternness. He's coming to knock heads. Actually, you can get it doesn't say that, by the way, but you get the sense. Same with the creeds, though. The creeds that have a wonderful purpose, but boy, you know, he's coming to judge living and the dead, coming in glory. His kingdom will have no end. And that's why it was so helpful for me to get a different image when I hear those words, Jesus is coming. The seminary musician at my seminary would love to invite people to chapel. Of course, that was his life's work. We had daily chapel in seminary, and yeah, chapel attendance was sometimes a problem. If that's surprising to you, then welcome to human nature. Chapel attendance at seminary, sometimes a little sketchy. But he would say, will you be in chapel today? Are you coming? And before you had a chance to answer, he would say, Jesus is coming. Joyfully. And I suppose some people might have thought, oh, he's saying Jesus is coming in glory to judge the living and the dead, and he'll know whether you were in chapel today. That is not what he was saying. And I think most people, if not all, knew exactly what he meant. Where two or three are gathered, there he is in the midst of us. Why don't you come? Jesus is coming. Perhaps the most important lesson for us today is to see how the risen Christ is revealed and known by far the most often in the assembly, among the gathered disciples. If what we need is help believing this thing that's hard to believe and trusting this thing that's hard to trust, for most of the disciples, through most of time, this is where they find what they need. Yes, those others get their special appearances. Paul, who needs to get confronted on the road, he gets that. And Mary, weeping in the garden, she gets the one she doesn't recognize, who speaks her name. Yes, and I'd be sending completely the wrong message if I left the impression that Jesus only showed up in the assembled believers. He is on the road. He is the unrecognized stranger. He is comforting those who weep. Yes, but by far the most of us have gotten our encounters when we gather in his name. The encounter may come simply through the testimony of those who believe with us, alongside us. You heard the testimony of John here in the epilogue. You haven't seen what I saw, but I've written this down for you so that you might know and come to believe or trust, and in believing and trusting have life in his name. Or as the first apostles heard it first from Mary, I've seen the Lord. Perhaps that's enough to stir the trust that we need. Or it may come when we are fearful, like those gathered behind locked doors, and know that he is in our midst. You know, we've struggled during these past years of the pandemic. On the one hand, I've seen how resilient this congregation is and stand in awe of that. And I've seen again and again how God is faithful in ways I wouldn't have known otherwise. But I think we've all felt how important it is to gather. How acutely we miss that. How important it is to gather to be who we're called to be, and especially to become who we're called to become. You know, there's an old preacher's yarn that I don't think I've used here. Excuse me if I have, but it's a good one. So if I have, I will tell it again. And it tells of a family that hadn't showed up in worship in a while. And the preacher stops by for a visit, and they sit around the fire, which tells you how old of a preacher's yarn this is. And as they make small talk, it's told that the pastor takes the poker, and you've seen how a burning log glows as it kind of turns into a coal. He knocks that a little bit, and some coals fall out onto the tile. And as they're talking, in just a matter of seconds, you can see the glow begins to disappear, the smoke rises, and soon they're in ashen gray. And they keep making small talk, and finally the preacher pushes those coals back in. And again, in only a matter of moments, they are again glowing. And it ends with the family simply saying something like, I think we understand each other, we'll be back in church, right? It's an old yarn, it's a little bit manipulative, but it's beautiful in that we experience that, don't we? This is hard to believe. And to keep believing in a world that, by all appearances, is still ruled by death. And so we come together and in the presence of one another, glow with that warmth of the Spirit, and sometimes get our resurrection appearances right when we need them. I think the Scripture's portrayal of the resurrection appearances should leave us maybe with two contrasting but compatible thoughts. One is to say that Jesus' presence can be counted on. For those first disciples and for us, it's like the sun coming up in the morning. You can count on it. You know, on the 8th day when they were gathered, there he was in the midst of them. And again on the 8th day they gathered, and again there he was. You know, it'll say in the breaking of the bread, they knew him to be with them. And again, they knew his presence in the breaking of the bread. It's like the coming of the dawn. But when are we aware of it? Well, that's a little different. That's not for us to manage or control. We can't make Jesus appear. That's a little bit more like, when will I see a rainbow again? I don't know, but you will. To close, again, seeing this through Thomas's experience, it's not how do we get the experience we want of the risen Christ. It's not how do we get all of our questions answered about the resurrection. But instead, how do we get to trust God? And how do we get to trust God again so that we can be transformed as those first disciples were transformed? The resurrection is hard to believe. Trust is hard. That's why you keep coming back. Jesus kept showing up for Thomas and the others to get them just what they needed, and he will do it for you too.